Rusted iron padlocks were the only thing standing between a financially ruined nurse and a 40-year-old secret. Clara broke the seal on her late uncle's forgotten mountain clinic, expecting unpaid tax bills and rotted wood, but instead found a high-security ward hiding a multi-million-dollar lie. The rain in Los Angeles felt unusually cruel the day Clara Jenkins finalized her divorce. At 38, she had spent the last decade working double shifts as an ER nurse at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, pouring every ounce of her energy and earnings into a marriage that was rotting from the inside out. Her ex-husband, Greg, a charismatic but profoundly reckless day trader, had managed to legally siphon away nearly everything they owned. Through a combination of hidden offshore accounts, a predatory post-nuptial agreement he had coerced her into signing, and a ruthless attorney, Greg walked away with the house in Pasadena and the bulk of their savings. Clara was left with a mountain of credit card debt she hadn't known existed, and a rented, one-bedroom apartment overlooking a noisy freeway. She was emotionally hollowed out, surviving on stale hospital coffee and sheer adrenaline. Then the thick manila envelope arrived. The return address belonged to Hilliard, Crane & Associates, a prestigious estate law firm located on Montgomery Street in San Francisco. Inside was a formal declaration that Clara's great-uncle, Dr. Arthur Pendleton, had passed away at the age of 91. Clara hadn't seen Arthur since she was a teenager. He was the family's eccentric black sheep, a formerly brilliant pulmonologist who had abandoned high society in the 1970s to open a private respiratory clinic in the remote, heavily forested slopes of Mount Shasta in Northern California. According to the paperwork, Arthur had died entirely without immediate family, leaving his sole remaining property, the Pendleton Alpine Retreat, to Clara. "It's heavily in arrears on property taxes, Miss Jenkins," Robert Hilliard, the stuffy senior partner, informed her over a brief, static-filled phone call. "The county was weeks away from seizing the land. You have two choices: sign it over to the state, or assume the debt and try to sell the land for a marginal profit. The structure itself is, well, it's considered practically derelict." But Clara, desperate and possessing absolutely nothing left to lose, saw a lifeline. Even if the land sold for a fraction of its former worth, it could wipe out the debt Greg had strapped to her name. She requested a week of personal leave from the hospital, packed her meager belongings into her 10-year-old Honda Civic, and began the grueling drive north up Interstate 5. Siskiyou County was a different world. As Clara wound her way up the serpentine mountain roads, the towering redwoods and dense pines swallowed the sunlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the damp asphalt. Mount Shasta loomed in the distance, its snow-capped peak piercing the fog like a jagged white tooth. The Pendleton Alpine Retreat sat at the end of a heavily overgrown gravel driveway, isolated from the nearest town by 10 miles of dense wilderness. It was a sprawling, 3-story structure built of heavy river stone and dark timber. It looked less like a medical facility and more like a fortress meant to withstand a siege. Waiting for her on the crumbling front steps was Henry Cobb, a weathered man in his late 60s, wearing a faded flannel jacket and heavy boots. Henry had been Arthur's groundskeeper, handyman, and sole companion for the last 2 decades. "You have his eyes," Henry said roughly by way of greeting, his voice like grinding gravel. He handed her a heavy iron keyring that looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon. "I've kept the pipes from freezing and the raccoons out of the kitchen, but that's about all I could manage since the doctor got sick. I haven't drawn a paycheck in 8 months. I only stayed because Arthur was, well, he was good to me once." "I appreciate you staying, Henry," Clara said, genuinely moved. "I'm going to put the place on the market. As soon as it sells, you'll be compensated for your back pay. I promise." Henry offered a grim, tight-lipped smile. "Good luck selling this dinosaur. The locals think the place is cursed, and the developers don't want the liability." He took her on a tour of the sprawling facility. The main floor was frozen in time, smelling of dust, pine needles, and stale antiseptic. The lobby featured a massive stone fireplace and mid-century leather furniture covered in canvas tarps. Wards A and B, located on the second floor, were lined with rusty iron bed frames and ancient oxygen tanks from the 1980s. It was creepy, but ultimately mundane. However, when they descended to the basement level, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew immediately colder, heavy with a strange metallic tang. At the end of a long concrete hallway stood a massive steel fire door. Unlike the rest of the clinic's wooden doors, this one was reinforced, heavy-gauge metal. A thick steel chain was wrapped around the handle, secured by a heavy-duty master padlock that looked entirely out of place in a 1970s clinic. Above the door, a faded plastic sign read, "Ward C, Infectious Isolation." "What's in there?" Clara asked, stepping closer. She noticed deep, frantic scratches scored into the concrete floor just beneath the door, as if heavy objects had been repeatedly dragged across the threshold. Henry stepped in front of her, his posture rigid. "Nothing you need to worry about. The doctor shut that ward down in 1985. Told me the foundation shifted and cracked the walls, making it structurally unsafe. He bought that padlock the same day and told me if I ever tried to open it, he'd shoot me on sight. Arthur was a strange man, Miss Jenkins. I took him at his word." Clara frowned, tracing her fingers over the rusted steel chain. As an ER nurse, she knew the protocol for infectious wards. They required ventilation, sealing, and constant monitoring, not heavy chains and threats of gun violence. "Where's the key?" she asked softly. Henry shook his head. "If there is one, I never saw it. Let it lie, Miss Jenkins. Some doors are locked for a reason." Clara spent her first 2 days cataloguing the clinic's meager assets and scrubbing decades of grime from the master bedroom. Sleep eluded her. The sheer silence of the mountain was deafening compared to the constant siren wail of Los Angeles. On the third night, unable to sleep, she ventured into Arthur's private study on the ground floor. The room was a chaotic mess of medical journals, tax documents, and half-empty bottles of scotch. While clearing out a heavy mahogany desk, she found a hidden drawer. Inside was a stack of black leather ledgers. Clara opened the top ledger, expecting patient records or inventory logs. Instead, she found a meticulous accounting of financial deposits dating from 1978 to 1986. There were no names, only patient numbers and staggering sums of money. Patient 04. Crocker National Bank transfer, $150,000. Patient 09. Physical deposit, gold bullion, $400,000 equivalent. Patient 14. Bearer bonds, Zurich, $850,000. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Millions of dollars had flowed into this remote mountain clinic during the 1980s. Arthur hadn't just been treating patients. He had been hiding something for them. Or hiding them. Crocker National Bank hadn't even existed since the mid-80s. Where did all this money go? The clinic's bank accounts were completely overdrawn when Arthur died. Before she could process the implications, the sudden, aggressive crunch of gravel outside shattered the mountain silence. Clara rushed to the window, her heart pounding. Headlights cut through the dense fog, illuminating a sleek silver BMW as it skidded to a halt near the front porch. A man stepped out, slamming the door. It was Greg. Panic seized her. She threw the ledger back into the desk drawer and locked it just as Greg began pounding on the heavy oak front door. "Clara, open up! I know you're in there. I saw your pathetic little Honda." She cracked the door open, keeping the chain engaged. "What are you doing here, Greg? How did you even find me?" Greg sneered, his perfectly styled hair damp from the mist. He looked exhausted, and there was a frantic, desperate edge to his eyes that she recognized from his worst days of day trading losses. "Public county records, Clara. A deed transfer is easy to track if you know where to look. Let me in. It's freezing. You have no business here. The divorce is final." "Ah, but the settlement isn't as bulletproof as you think," Greg said, leaning against the doorframe. "My lawyer caught a technicality. Any real estate inherited or acquired within 90 days of the final decree is still subject to community property mediation in the state of California. Half of this dumping ground is mine, Clara. And considering my crypto portfolio just tanked, I need liquid cash. I'm here to make sure you don't sell this land out from under me." Clara felt a cold fury wash over her. He had taken her home, her savings and her peace of mind, and now he was trying to pick the bones of her only lifeline. "The place is worthless, Greg. It's $40,000 in debt to the county." "We'll see about that. Let me in, or I call the local sheriff and show him our marriage paperwork and my lawyer's injunction." Knowing Greg would happily cause a scene that could jeopardize everything, Clara unchained the door and let him in. Greg swaggered into the lobby, mocking the dusty furniture and the peeling wallpaper. He claimed the guest room on the first floor, promising to stay until a county appraiser could come up the mountain. Clara retreated to her room upstairs, her mind racing. Greg was desperate. If he found out about the ledgers, or if he suspected there was any hidden wealth in this clinic, he would tear the place apart with his bare hands. She had to figure out what Arthur had been hiding, and she had to do it tonight, before Greg started snooping. At 200 a.m., the clinic was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic snoring coming from Greg's room. Clara slipped into a thick sweater, grabbed an industrial flashlight, and crept out to the maintenance shed in the back. Henry had left a heavy-duty pair of bolt cutters hanging on a pegboard. They weighed nearly 15 pounds, the iron handles cold and unforgiving in her grip. She moved silently back into the clinic, bypassing the creaky wooden stairs and taking the concrete service stairwell down to the basement. The air grew frigid. Clara stood before the heavy steel door of Ward C, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The massive padlock looked impenetrable, but she noticed the steel chain holding it was heavily rusted from decades of damp basement air. Clara wedged the jaws of the bolt cutters around a heavily oxidized link in the chain. She braced her foot against the wall, threw her entire body weight onto the handles, and squeezed. Her muscles screamed in protest. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the confined hallway, the metal gave way. Clara froze, holding her breath, waiting for Greg's footsteps. A minute passed. Nothing but silence. She unwrapped the heavy chain, letting it slide to the concrete floor with a dull thud. Grabbing the handle of the steel door, she pulled. It shrieked in protest, the hinges groaning as they moved for the first time in nearly 40 years. Clara stepped over the threshold, sweeping her flashlight across the darkness. She expected to see rows of rusted hospital beds or abandoned medical equipment. Instead, the beam of light illuminated a massive climate-controlled corridor lined with polished steel. The walls were not made of drywall. They were reinforced concrete, retrofitted with heavy steel plates. Ward C wasn't a medical wing at all. Clara walked slowly down the corridor, her shoes echoing off the metal floor. The space opened up into a large central room. In the center of the room sat rows of heavy green metal filing cabinets and several large industrial safes, the kind used in commercial banks. But what made her blood run cold wasn't the safes. It was the walls. Lining the perimeter of the room were 5 small, glass-fronted isolation cells. Inside each cell was a single leather armchair, an IV drip stand, and a high-end vintage record player. And scattered across the floor of the cells, spilling out of ripped canvas bags, were hundreds of shimmering, heavy gold coins, stacks of yellowed bearer bonds, and diamond jewelry that caught the flashlight's beam, sparkling like terrifying stars in the dark. Arthur Pendleton hadn't been treating sick people down here. He had been providing a hyper-secure, off-the-grid sanctuary for incredibly wealthy people who needed to vanish. As Clara stepped toward the nearest cell to inspect a spilled canvas bag stamped with the faded logo of Crocker National Bank, she heard a sound that made her stomach drop. It was the distinct, slow clapping of hands coming from the darkness of the hallway behind her. "Well, well, well," Greg's voice echoed off the steel walls, dripping with predatory greed. "I knew this creepy old place was hiding something, but I didn't think it would be the mother lode." Greg stepped fully into the beam of Clara's flashlight, his eyes wide and feverish as they darted across the shattered canvas bags and the glittering piles of wealth. The sheer magnitude of the fortune scattered across the concrete floor of Ward's defied comprehension. There were gold Krugerrands, tightly bound stacks of century-old treasury notes, and velvet pouches bleeding cascades of raw diamonds. "Greg, don't touch anything," Clara warned, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and professional authority. She kept her distance, the heavy iron bolt cutters still resting against her leg. "This isn't ours. We don't know who this belongs to or why my uncle locked it away down here." "Are you insane?" Greg scoffed, his designer loafers crunching over fallen debris as he walked toward the center of the room. He knelt beside a spilled bag, picking up a heavy gold coin and examining it under the dim emergency lights that still faintly hummed along the ceiling. "This is untraceable, Clara. Bearer bonds and raw gold? This is ghost money. Your crazy uncle was running a black market bank for criminals, and now it belongs to us. Half of this is legally mine." Clara swept her flashlight away from Greg and toward a rusted metal desk situated near the heavy bank safes. On top of the desk sat a heavy, leather-bound ledger, identical to the ones she had found upstairs, alongside a clipboard holding yellowed, water-damaged manifests. Warning: unauthorized access to Ward C will result in immediate catastrophic lockdown. Dr. Arthur Pendleton, Facility Director. Clara read the faded label pasted to the desk. Beside it, the clipboard detailed a chilling inventory of the clinic's patients. "Greg, look at this," Clara urged, her voice trembling as she analyzed the data. "Every single person who brought money down here is listed as deceased. They didn't just store their wealth here. They died here. This wasn't a bank. It was a hospice for criminals trying to hide from the law. They came here to disappear, and Arthur kept their money when they passed. "I don't care if they were the board of directors for the local PTA," Greg barked. He had already shrugged off his expensive tailored jacket and was frantically stuffing gold coins and diamond pouches into the sleeves, tying the cuffs into knots to create makeshift bags. "This is my ticket out of debt. I lost $2 million in offshore accounts last week, Clara. $2 million. This gold is going to make me whole again." Clara watched him devolve into a frantic, greedy animal. She stepped back towards the heavy steel door, her survival instincts screaming at her to leave. The air in the room was growing oppressively stale, carrying the faint, sickeningly sweet scent of bitter almonds and old dust. "You can't just walk out of here with bags of stolen gold, Greg. Henry is upstairs. He knows we're down here. Henry is an old fool who can be bought for $5,000, Greg muttered, moving from the glass-fronted isolation cells to the massive industrial safes in the center of the room. The safes were archaic, built by the Mosler Safe Company, featuring massive brass dials and heavy locking levers. "Don't touch that!" Clara shouted, but Greg was completely lost to his own avarice. He grabbed the heavy brass locking lever of the largest Mosler safe and wrenched it downward with all his might, hoping the sheer force would pop the ancient mechanism. He didn't open the safe. Instead, a loud mechanical grinding noise echoed from the walls, vibrating through the concrete floor. Clang! Clara spun around. The massive steel fire door she had forced open suddenly slammed shut with a deafening crash, propelled by pneumatic pistons hidden within the doorframe. Before she could even take a step toward it, 4 heavy cylindrical deadbolts shot out from the steel frame, locking deep into the concrete walls. The padlock chain she had cut was irrelevant. Arthur had rigged the entire room as a massive, impenetrable trap. "Greg!" Clara screamed, rushing to the door and pounding her fists against the cold, unyielding steel. "What did you do?" Greg dropped his makeshift bags of gold, his face going totally pale. He rushed to the door, shoving Clara aside, and began kicking the steel plates frantically. "Open! Open the damn door!" But the door was a solid slab of reinforced metal, designed to withstand explosives. They were sealed inside Ward C, entombed with millions of dollars in ghost money and the ghosts of Arthur's wealthiest, most corrupt patients. Above them, the faint hum of the ceiling lights sputtered, flickered, and suddenly died, plunging the vault into absolute, suffocating darkness. Clara's heavy-duty industrial flashlight was the only thing standing between them and total blackness. "Give me the light!" Greg demanded, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. He lunged for the flashlight in Clara's hand, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. Clara sidestepped him, shining the beam directly into his eyes to blind him momentarily. "Back off, Greg. If you attack me, I will turn this off and leave you in the dark. Sit down and shut up so I can think." Her command, honed by years of managing aggressive, panicked patients in the ER trauma ward at Cedars Sinai, sliced through his hysteria. Greg stumbled backward, breathing heavily, and collapsed against one of the glass isolation cells, clutching his chest. Clara took a deep breath, forcing her racing heart to slow down. Panic meant hyperventilation. Hyperventilation meant consuming oxygen faster. In a sealed subterranean vault, oxygen was their most critical and finite resource. She swept the beam of the flashlight across the ceiling. There were no visible air vents, which made sense for an infectious isolation ward designed in the 1970s. Everything would have been filtered through a centralized, negative pressure scrubber system. But Arthur had locked this room down over 40 years ago. The scrubbers were dead. She moved back to the metal desk and the clipboard. Think like a doctor. Think like a facility manager. Arthur wouldn't build a vault without an emergency manual override in case he accidentally trapped himself inside. Clara began ripping open the drawers of the rusted desk. Inside the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a stack of blank death certificates, she found a heavy, rolled-up set of architectural blueprints stamped by a San Francisco engineering firm. She spread the blueprints across the desk, tracing the white lines with trembling fingers. The vault was a retrofitted bomb shelter. The main door was the primary entrance, but according to the schematics, there was a secondary ventilation shaft designed for emergency purge protocols. It was located behind the third isolation cell. "Get up," Clara ordered Greg, pointing the flashlight toward the back wall. "There's an emergency exhaust hatch behind that cell. We have to move the furniture and pry off the wall panel." Greg scrambled to his feet, a renewed glimmer of hope in his eyes. However, as he moved, he stopped to scoop up the jacket sleeves filled with raw diamonds and gold coins. "Leave it, Greg," Clara said firmly. "The exhaust shaft is 24 inches wide. You have to crawl straight up for 15 feet. You cannot carry 50 pounds of metal." "I'm not leaving it," Greg snarled, clutching the heavy bundles to his chest. "I earned this. You owe me this for dragging me through that nightmare of a marriage." Clara stared at him, a profound sense of clarity washing over her. She realized in that dark, suffocating room that she didn't just want a divorce from Greg. She needed to amputate him from her life entirely. He was a disease, a parasitic infection that would drag her down into the dark forever if she let him. "Suit yourself," she said coldly. She marched to the third isolation cell. The glass was thick, but Clara picked up the heavy bolt cutters she had dropped earlier and swung them like a baseball bat. The tempered glass shattered into a million glittering pieces. She stepped inside the small cell, ignoring the ruined leather chair and the scattered bearer bonds on the floor. At the back of the cell, hidden behind a false panel of drywall, was a heavy steel grate. Clara wedged the tip of the bolt cutters behind the grate and heaved. Screws stripped out of 40-year-old wood, and the heavy metal cover clattered to the ground. Behind it was a narrow, vertical shaft lined with rusty iron rungs. A faint, freezing draft of fresh mountain air drifted down from above. "I found it," Clara called out. "I'm going up." She squeezed her shoulders into the tight, claustrophobic space and began the agonizing climb. The rust from the rungs flaked into her eyes, and the darkness above was terrifying. Below her, Greg grunted as he tried to follow. He had shoved his heavy bundles of stolen treasure ahead of him, trying to push them up the shaft. "Clara, wait! It's stuck! The bags are wedged against the rungs!" Greg's voice echoed up the metal tube, echoing with raw desperation. "Help me pull them up!" Clara paused, looking down. The beam of her flashlight illuminated Greg, his face red and contorted, desperately trying to yank the heavy, knot-tied sleeves of gold free from where they had wedged tight between the iron ladder and the concrete wall. He was completely blocking his own path, trapped by his own insurmountable greed. "Let go of the gold, Greg," Clara yelled down. "Drop it, or you're going to suffocate down there." "No, it's mine!" he screamed, yanking violently at the bags. Clara shook her head. She had spent a decade trying to save a man who actively wanted to drown. She wasn't going to do it anymore. She turned off her flashlight, plunging the shaft into darkness, and continued to climb toward the faint square of grey moonlight above her. 10 minutes later, Clara pushed open the rusted exterior grate and dragged herself out into the freezing, rain-slicked mud behind the clinic. The cold mountain air tasted like pure salvation. She stumbled around to the front of the clinic, where Henry was waiting on the porch, a loaded shotgun resting casually in his arms. He looked at Clara, then at the open basement door, and gave a slow, knowing nod. "Told you some doors stay locked for a reason, Miss Jenkins," Henry rumbled softly. "Call the county sheriff, Henry," Clara said, her voice steady and resolute as she wiped mud and rust from her face. "And then call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a lot of stolen federal property in the basement." The aftermath was a media spectacle that dominated national headlines for months. The Internal Revenue Service, the FBI, and investigators from the California State Attorney's Office swarmed the Pendleton Alpine retreat. When authorities finally breached the heavy doors of Ward C, they found Greg alive, but utterly broken. He had spent 3 days trapped in the dark, weeping over bags of gold he couldn't spend, surrounded by the skeletons of Arthur's criminal empire. The federal government confiscated the entirety of the stolen wealth, totaling nearly $42 million in recovered assets from defunct entities like Crocker National Bank and unregistered shell companies. However, because Clara had acted as a whistleblower and fully cooperated with the federal investigation, citing the IRS Whistleblower Office protocols, she was awarded a massive tax-free finder's fee amounting to 15% of the recovered assets. Clara paid off the county tax debts, legally dissolving her ties to the mountain clinic. She paid Henry a handsome severance package, ensuring the old groundskeeper could retire comfortably on the Oregon coast. She returned to Los Angeles not as a ruined, indebted nurse, but as an incredibly wealthy, independent woman. Greg, facing federal charges for attempting to steal evidence in an active federal investigation, disappeared into the penal system. Clara Jenkins had finally cured the sickness in her life, leaving the shadows of the mountain and her past far behind her. Did Clara make the right choice leaving Greg behind, or would you have tried to save him? The Forgotten Mountain Clinic held $1 million secret, but the real cost was human greed. If you loved this dramatic true crime-inspired story and want more thrilling mysteries, hidden treasures, and shocking real-life plot twists, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with all your friends. Ring the bell to catch every single new update.